Let's start. So welcome everyone, and apologies for the technical difficulties, but if you've been on Zoom meetings before, you know that this is kind of part of the fun of Zoom. My name is Schmidt. I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library, and I'm logging in from London. And very pleased to welcome you to today's the second day of a very interesting conference, today's session on gender and sexuality. And as you know, each speaker will have 7 minutes to present, and then we'll take questions via the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't tested that out before, feel free. You can send me a private chat if you want. There's a little drop-down menu within the chat feature, or you can send it to everyone. But we'll take questions after the end of each presentation. So let's get started with the first is Dr. Megan Pitka of Northwestern University. She can start sharing her screen now. Her paper is Active National Forgetting and Sexual Violence in Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, 1939 to 1947. So I'm going to ask Megan to take it away. Where is she?
Is Megan here?
Megan is not here. I thought I saw her earlier. Maybe she was kicked out and didn't come back in. Should we move on to the second paper? And then if she comes, we can...
Okay, so let's do the... Yes.
I will write to Megan now, so you can just start with the second one.
Okay, we'll start with the second paper.
So Lauren, I know Lauren is here, my neighbor from King's College. Lauren Cantillon is a PhD candidate at King's College, and she's going to be speaking on her paper titled, I Must Tell You a Story Again, Unpacking the Sexual Violence Continuum Across the Survivor's Mnemonic Output. So Lauren, you can please share your screen.
I'm getting a notification that says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Check that.
You have to stop share, Boaz.
Yeah, Boaz, you have to start.
Okay, stop share.
Okay.
No, I'm not sharing now.
You are. Yes.
It was share. No.
Yes, you are. Stop share.
I stopped sharing.
Okay.
So now it's your turn, Doreen.
I'm still getting the same thing coming up, so I'll just speak. Yeah, okay. So the title of this paper is taken from Holocaust testimony interviews with a survivor named Yeti Starensis, born in February 1929 in the then Polish city of Lvov. As far as I'm aware, Yeti gave 2 survivor interviews, both to the Florida Holocaust Museum, firstly in November 1999, with the second in March 2001, conducted by different interviewers. I Must Tell You a Story is her repeated introductory phrase to recounting being sexually assaulted in 1941. In this paper, I will examine how Yeti remembers and narrates this story across the 2 interviews, while also exploring how she talks about a separate sexual assault only fully recounted in one interview. Both assaults took place when Yeti was a child, aged 12 and 13. On the screen, well, what would be on the screen are extracts of Yeti recounting being sexually assaulted by the Ukrainian policeman in 1941, and you would have been able to see the very, a direct comparison between how she narrates this in the 2 interviews. So while Yeti defines this as a failed rape, she still recounts striking details of a violent sexual assault. Her hair braids were unravelled, suggesting her attacker was close enough to molest her, and the stutter across both interviews when introducing her attacker, the big shot, that's a quote, may allude to embodied terror and fear felt at the time. I have highlighted, as again you would be able to see, where her language and phrasing is noticeably similar across the 2 interviews, but what you wouldn't be able to see is how the placement of this story within her wider Holocaust narrative shifts. Several scholars have compared multiple interviews from the same survivor, but it is Brian Schiff's work that I use here. He notes that while the what that is recounted remains fairly consistent across multiple interviews, changes may be observed in the how or the why the story is told. So why does Yeti move this recollection around? The answer. Yeah. Part of the answer lies in her recounting of the second sexual assault. In the 1999 interview, Yeti remembers how a German soldier stationed in Lvov began to follow her around the barracks she worked in. While initially scared of the soldier, Yeti describes how this man believed she looked so much like a German girl that she thought it would be possible for her to survive with folds. He gave her money and a crucifix necklace to wear as part of her disguise. Yeti purchased the papers, which in turn enabled her to go to Germany as a foreign slave labourer and avoid the concentration camp system. When I first listened to Yeti's 1999 interview, I seemed to hear some kind of sexual something in relation to this story. Why would a German soldier go to such a risk for a Jewish girl who he didn't already know? The only explanation offered was Yeti's recollection of the soldier saying, "Maybe if I save your life, God will save mine." I honestly wondered if I was being cynical, but listening to her 2001 interview showed my suspicions were not unfounded. There would be a slide at this point showing a quote, so I'll do my best to illustrate what you would have been able to see. So during the second interview, the interviewer asks, "Did you have a relationship with him in any way?" Yeti's response is confirmatory, saying that it was sad because I was a virgin and he didn't realise that, which is what you should be able to see. I would like to reiterate that at this point in time, 1942, Yeti was 13, a vulnerable underage child. To be shown affection and interest by an older man who then provides financial support, to me this brings to mind a child being groomed. It is disturbing to think of a 13-year-old and an adult having sex as being a relationship. However, I would suggest that the interviewer is actually picking up on Yeti's own positive portrayal of the German soldier. By this point in the interview, she has called him "my angel," and is subtly echoing it back to her. Henry Greenspan has written about the importance of an interviewer being perceived as a good listener by their participant. The interview is a co-production, and good listening may result in more details being shared by a participant. By maintaining a non-confrontational line of questioning and echoing Yeti herself, the interviewer signals that he is an unhostile listener, something I think is significant as to why she chooses to share details withheld in her earlier interview. While the interviewer does not challenge Yeti's interpretation, there is a key moment later in the 2001 interview which may point to internal confusion that Yeti is unable to personally voice. A question from the interviewer asking if she ever told her husband about the German soldier prompts Yeti to include her daughter's angry reaction when Yeti shared what happened to her. And again, this would have been a quote on your screen so you could fully get the picture of what her daughter's reaction was. In short, it was very angry, and Yeti quotes her daughter as having said about the German soldier, "Oh, he only wanted you for that," and that Yeti thought, her daughter thought that it was inappropriate for him to do that. This raises a question about how survivors use other voices in order to address tensions and conflicts involved in sharing difficult stories publicly. Does the inclusion of her daughter's interpretation imply that, on some level, Yeti was or remains uncomfortable, upset, angry at what happened to her? We hear the mediated remembering of Yeti the adult. Yeti the 13-year-old may have had different feelings. For Yeti the adult, she interprets both her own and her children's existence as a direct result of the actions of the German soldier. She ties her identity as a survivor to this. Perhaps it was easier and less destructive for Yeti to subdue more complicated emotions, to publicly characterize this man in terms of romance and deification, rather than as someone who groomed and raped her. Such feelings of ambivalence are common in child sex abuse survivors, as explored by Janice Harkin, Paula Reevey, and Stephen D. Brown. This leads me back to the question of stories being moved around in survivor narratives. In 2001, Yeti follows up the recounting of her daughter's anger with the story of the 1941 assault by the Ukrainian policemen. In her eyes, it is an easy contrast, as the Ukrainian policeman, unlike the German soldier, has no redeemable features. He did not save her life. Yet in 1999, she recounts this story much earlier, and it fulfills a different purpose, to explain her belief that fate slated her to live. How the trope of fate interacts with her remembering of sexual assault is fascinating, but sadly I don't have time to elaborate further on that. I conclude with addressing how Yeti's interviews are indexed by the Visual History Archive, which represents an uncomfortable structural denial and silencing of individuals who survived sexual abuse as children during the Holocaust. The VHA does not have an indexing term specific to child sex assault. The closest term is child abuse. More worrying is that Yeti's recounting of sex with the German soldier at age 13 is indexed as hiding related sexual activities, implying consent impossible to give for a statutory rape. Archives are not neutral. They shape what researchers may access, which in turn shapes our perception of the past. Andrea Petu has previously called attention to the politics of indexing around sexualized violence and rape at the VHA, and I extend that to include the sexual abuse of children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for keeping to time. Moving right on to our next paper so that we have plenty of time afterward to address questions. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bev Chalmers to share her screen. She's an independent scholar in Canada, and her focus is on child sex abuse in the Holocaust. So hopefully you can share your screen. There we go. Great.
So my slideshow from the beginning, which I can't get to do. There you go. Okay, I'm very pleased to see my slides up because I did not have any alternative. I will be talking today about child sex abuse in the Holocaust based on my book, which was published just a month ago, called Betrayed: Child Sex Abuse in the Holocaust. I began to work on this book because in my earlier book, Birth, Sex and Abuse, talking about women's birth experiences and their sexual experiences during the Holocaust, I uncovered a number of records of child sex abuse. And I realized that this really had not been comprehensively put together. So I tried to integrate information about them. As we know, about 1.6 million Jewish children were killed, were in Europe in 1939, about 1.1 to 1.5, and the numbers estimates vary from person to person, were killed. Overall, about 33% of Europe's Jews survived, but only 5 to 11% of Jewish children survived. So for me, the question became, who should I regard as a child when researching and searching for information and testimonies? I tried to stay within the concept of under 14, and I specifically looked for testimonies of children born between 1930 and 1945, although there's beyond these ranges as well. The sources of information about children are scarce. For one thing, there were no records of children who were hidden. It was not safe to keep those records. Children also were too young to record their stories themselves, many of them, and also it was too dangerous to do so. At least 55 diaries of children have survived, either in full or mostly in part. But there are also multiple testimonies of people given who were children at the time of the Holocaust. And there are also adult memoirs, adult people who've written their stories later and have included information about child sex abuse. The Shoah Foundation, as we know, has at least 52, more than that, testimonies. Of these, 459 were Jewish children born between 1930 and 1945. Of those, 285 were in English, but not all report sexual abuse. And sadly, I am only able to access the English ones for myself. In my book, Betrayed, I managed to include 160 accounts of children who had reported child sex abuse. And I have tables at the end of the book which include each of these incidents and their ages, who the perpetrators were, who the children were, where it happened, and so on. But the average age of abuse of these children was 11 years old. The subject, as the previous speaker mentioned, is concealed in many archives. When I attended my first archive to ask for information and help about this, I was immediately told this subject is taboo. And that proved to be true in a number of archives, which refused me access to their records, even though they would tell me there were some records about child sex abuse. They would not allow me access. The kind of reactions I got was that it's not necessary to talk about this. It's degrading to children and to Jewish people, that we should prevent re-traumatizing the victim or the family of those victims, that we don't believe. Many people after the war did not believe children's stories, that these stories could be misused perhaps by Holocaust deniers or revisionists, and other reactions were, that's impossible. Never would a German, an SS soldier, touch a Jewish girl. It was forbidden. So these were some of the obstacles I encountered in trying to deal with them, and I deal with this in great detail in the book as well. But on the whole, where did child sex abuse occur? Everywhere. In homes during the early parts of the Nazi era, in the ghettos, in labor camps, extermination camps, as part of medical experiments. It occurred primarily in children who were in hiding. The Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht, as they entered into the eastern countries, were also complicit in these crimes. Some of the Kindertransport children were sexually abused. Children who were sent to safety beyond Europe's borders, to the UK, to Canada, to America, were also abused. And even children in the DP camps after the war were sexually abused. Most of the time they were abused as Jews, but sometimes they were Jewish children passing for Aryan who were then also abused. The types of abuse that I came across, witnessing sexuality, being fondled, humiliated sexually, voyeurism, rape, sexuality that was exchanged for survival. Obviously the sexual experiences of the peoples in the camps and the girls who were forced into prostitution in the camps, in part of the medical experiments. In some cases, sexualized brutality was part of the story. Even bestiality was reported by at least one person, and another person also reported surviving by the use of writing sexual humor to entertain the Nazis. The perpetrators were a whole range of people again, German soldiers, Nazis, and in hiding in particular. Sometimes it was the fathers in the hiding family, or the siblings, or other family members or friends of the family. Farmers where children hid, the Russian liberators as they came in, Allied soldiers in the DP camps, and after the war, foster parents or step-parents were also involved. In rare occasions, Jews were involved in perpetrating sexual abuse of children. For example, I can give you two stories. One is remarkable stories. One of Molly's, Melania Weissenberg, whose book is written as in the name of Molly, Molly's Diary. She was hidden during the years 1942 to 1945 with her older cousin, Helene, underground in a hole in the ground, basically the size of a mattress, where she and her cousin could lie down during the day and hardly sit up, could not sit up properly. And she was hidden there by a farmer, Victor, and his sister in Poland for 2 years. And when she and her cousin began to realize that he might betray them and reveal their hiding place, they arranged to exchange sex for survival, and they kept him interested in keeping them hidden through the process of sexual exchange. It's a remarkable diary. Susie Berghofer is another example of children. She and her sister Lottie were sent on the Kindertransport to the UK, and they were sheltered by a reverend man and his wife. She was assaulted from the age of 9 years on for many, many years, and she was manipulated into doing so because her sister was ailing, and the reverend only agreed to look after the sister if she would comply with his wishes. Eventually, many years later, she discovered her Jewish origin. She chased them back. The reverends did not let them know that she was Jewish at first. And he was never formally charged. Although his activities were exposed quite publicly, he was never formally charged for these acts. There are multiple stories of children. These are just 2 out of the 160 in the book. And it's a horrific process. After the war, these children's experiences were denied. People would say to them, "You were just a child. What could you know about such things?" Or they would say, "It's best to forget such things, move on." Feelings of horror or terror, their vulnerability, their feelings of betrayal were discounted, leading them to distrust adults, distrust the people after the war. Left them with very painful childhood memories, and many expressed the feeling that life is not worth living. Even though they had managed to make a life for themselves, marriages, children, they would still say, "I would go to bed hoping I would not wake up in the morning." The consequences of sexual abuse during this time were certain marital difficulties, an inability to enjoy sex, reluctance to become pregnant amongst the women, multiple psychological disorders, and these people experienced many more physical disorders than others who had not been sexually abused. How did this all happen during the Holocaust? The Nazis prohibited sex with Jews. It was forbidden.
Sorry to interrupt, Bev. I just have to say about 30 seconds left.
That's about what I've got to do. The Holocaust facilitated child sex abuse. The children themselves felt betrayed by their parents, by their rescuers, after the Holocaust, by the archivists, and they're being betrayed now by scholars who don't wish to explore this. And these 2 experiences of child sex abuse in the Holocaust are the most traumatizing for all children. These books were written to honor the children's memories, not to degrade them in any way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev, and thank you for tying up quickly. So apologies for the interruption. It's very good to have your paper alongside Lauren's, because I think a lot of the questions and issues you raised are very similar. And we can now move on to Victoria Martinez's paper. She's a PhD candidate at Linköping University in Sweden. Actually, Bev, if you could, yes, exactly, great. And then I'd like to invite Victoria to share her screen if she has a PowerPoint. Great.
Can you see it?
Her topic is women survivors in Sweden. Yes, can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christine, and hello, everyone. Thank you to Drs. Boaz Cohen and Daniela Ozaki-Stern, as well as the other organizers and participants in this conference. It's been a pleasure to hear their presentations, and I'm really happy that I'm able to contribute today. So, as Christine said, I am working on my PhD in history at Linköping University in Sweden, and my dissertation topic is the afterlives of women who survived Nazi concentration camps and came to Sweden as refugees. For those of you unfamiliar with Holocaust and other survivors of Nazi persecution in Sweden during the immediate post-war period, this slide provides some background. As you can see, in mid-1945, some 25,000 to 31,000 liberated prisoners of Nazi concentration camps came to Sweden, either via the White Buses expedition in the spring or the White Ships operation in the summer. Due to the time limit, I will not further expand on the information in this slide, but we'll leave it on the screen for a moment as I continue. In Sweden, there is a good body of scholarship on subjects like Swedish bystanderism, refugee policy, and the rescue and relief efforts which brought these Holocaust and concentration camp survivors to Sweden. Few, if any, studies focus on or analyze the survivors as actors. As scholar Lisa Malky has observed in regard to modern refugees, the social processes and practices associated with the delivery of relief to refugees have a dehistoricizing effect, which makes it, and I quote, difficult for people in the refugee category to be approached as historical actors rather than simply as mute victims, end quote. Gender enhances this effect. With women refugees, excuse me, my cat. with women refugees perceived mainly or only as passive victims whose, quote, vulnerability is generally based on the assumption that they are dependent and passive in decision-making roles, end quote. Their agency, subjectivity, and role as agents of change in their own and others' lives have been, up to and including the present day, largely ignored. This has been true in Sweden, where, as historian Malin Tortureby has demonstrated, virtually from the moment they stepped or were carried ashore in Sweden, survivors of Nazi concentration camps became part of, quote, narratives about a good, democratic country and a well-organized refugee relief program, end quote. Though the experiences of individual survivors and specific religious and ethnic groups were not ignored, they primarily served to affirm Swedish culture, policy, and action, both during and after the war. This has not changed significantly in the past 75 years. Even in scholarship, which examines the survivors' experiences, little attention is given to the past taken by those who came here as refugees, or places them, their subjectivities, and their agency at the center of Swedish historical and cultural heritage narratives. Yes, particularly since the 1990s, Holocaust survivors have been visible and vocal in Sweden. However, as scholar Christine Wagrell has argued, constructions of the Holocaust survivor in Swedish public discourse have alternated between silence and excess, which have demonstrated, quote, that attitudes toward the utility of the survivor in Sweden have been ambivalent at best, end quote. Furthermore, Wagrell argues, quote, female victims of the Holocaust have continued to be reduced to their wounds, end quote. For more than 3 years, I have been researching the lives of survivors who came to Sweden. Early on, I began to identify and focus on women who have in different ways played significant and meaningful roles in Swedish culture and society, which have not been fully recognized or analyzed. The subjects of my research thus include women whom I have broadly categorized into the groups you can see on this slide. Empirical material exists on these women, much of it in Swedish archives, some of it in what feminist theorist Rosie Braidotti calls affective traces. Yet little, if any, of this material has been analyzed, at least not with a focus on the women as actors, agents, or subjects in socio-historical processes. As a result, the lives, experiences, and contributions to Swedish society of the women I am researching have not been incorporated in any significant or meaningful way, if at all, into either Swedish national historical and cultural heritage discourses, or in specific ones such as scientific, Holocaust, Second World War, refugees and migration, women's, labor, and humanitarianism. Recognizing that, to paraphrase oral historian Hank Greenspan, survivors' whole lives are their testament and monument, my dissertation will place the women I am researching at the center of the analysis as both survivors and something more. While there is no doubt that survivors' experiences during the destruction are incredibly important, a singular focus on spoken and written testimony neglects the fact that the afterlives of Holocaust and other survivors of Nazi persecution also provide much important insight. In the case of the women I am researching, this is especially true in regard to their role in socio-historical processes, such as the very rescue and relief efforts that brought them to Sweden, and in the breaking of social and gender boundaries in the post-war era. Whether engaged in providing care to other survivors, breaking through professional glass ceilings, or merely clinging to life, these women enacted a vision of survivor that has been given little space in Swedish post-war narratives. New understandings of their agency and action will, I argue, contribute to new understandings of history and cultural heritage, and not only in Sweden. I will conclude here with thanks for your time and interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Very interesting paper, and also thank you for keeping to time. I see the questions are flying in, so we'll be sure to get to those after we hear from Dr. Jay Geller, who is at Vanderbilt University and who will be speaking about circumcision and male Jewish survival during the Shoah. So Jay, can I ask you to unmute yourself and share your screen if you have a PowerPoint?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm unmuted, I hope. Okay. Circumcision, as the assumed to be universal but practically hidden corporeal trace of Jewish difference, functioned verbally and visually to identify the Jew in continental European societies, since uncircumcision among non-Jewish males was near universal. National Socialist ideology presumed that Jews were racially distinct, but despite extensive efforts to uncover Jewish racial difference, Nazi seriologists, physiologists, physical anthropologists, and other race scientists found no demonstrable biological basis to support this view. The circumcised penis, therefore, provided a practical solution for locating Jewish male difference. In Nazi-occupied Europe, even with authentic papers, linguistic fluency, knowledge of Christian prayers and practices, and an Aryan appearance, male anatomy was destiny. So if, when confronted, a man denied being a Jew, his enemies would pull down his pants, a circumcised male Jew was ever at risk. Scenes of threatened exposure, efforts to avoid such situations, and responses when they were unavoidable are significant topoi of both Shoah survivor testimony and memoir. These topoi are no less prominent in stories and novels written by survivors. Yet the scholarly literature on Jews in hiding or trying to pass only makes passing mention of the threat posed by the uncovered circumcised penis. And usually it is limited to variants of Esfoli and Chalmers. Free of the physical marking that circumcision imposed on men, it was easier for women of Aryan appearance to avoid detection. Circumcision, however, was neither simply a self-evidently dangerous happenstance of most Jewish males in Nazi-occupied Europe, nor were scenes of threatened exposure only of anecdotal value. My research endeavors to demonstrate its extensive and manifold effects on Jewish men's and women's daily life and death choices, experiences, feelings, Jewish gender and self-identities during the Shoah. In the course of the last 2 years, I have accessed thousands of audiovisual testimonies in English, French, and German, as well as English summaries or translations in 7 other languages, from the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yale's Fortunoff Archive, and other sites. In addition, I have surveyed many hundreds of autobiographies, memoirs, diaries, collections of testimonies, biographies, survivor novels, stories, plays, and films, as well as scholarly works. For the 628 individual audiovisual testimonies I have transcribed, I have created a spreadsheet with more than 80 distinct multivariable rubrics covering 950 scenes. Beyond the trouser tests at razzias, ID controls, and blackmailer stops, witnesses recall stripping for delousing at POW or internment camps, for required medical examinations at conscripted labor sites, and for unavoidable visits to doctors or hospitals. Others recount dressing and bathing at schools or orphanages, pissing contests or swimming parties with local youth, engaging in or avoiding sex. Still others discuss decisions to circumcise an infant son in ghettos when hiding or after liberation, whether to attempt surgical, do-it-yourself, or ad hoc means to feign a foreskin, or to cross-dress, or conversely, to assume a Muslim identity. In the audio-visual archive, I encounter many reasons for the relative lack of attention to the relation between circumcision and male Jewish survival. Among witnesses, these include discursive propriety. For example, one does not talk about penises in public. And notions of masculinity. For example, the discomfort when it comes to revealing how one's penis rendered one vulnerable. And beyond the frailties and plasticities of memory are the tacit expectations of what constitutes a Holocaust testimony. In many interviews, men refer to their circumcised penises only through gesture, hands or eyes pointed downward, or indirect speech, they saw I was Jewish. Or they describe a scene where the unsaid circumcision is at issue. I never went swimming with them. How often does the phrase, I looked too Jewish, screen the unsaid circumcision as primary rationale for going into hiding and remaining indoors rather than trying to pass in public. There are also many potential obstacles built into the protocols, scripts, and goals of both the interview and the indexing processes. Moreover, I have transcribed circumcision-related material from more than 100 memoirs and diaries, and from an additional 75 plus accounts from testimony collections. In addition, my database includes more than 25 literary works by survivors, over 75 historical, psychological, sociological, or literary critical studies, 12 films, a number of photographs, and other material artifacts. Amassing this verbal and visual archive presented its own problems. For example, under the subject rubric, Holocaust, Jewish, 1939-1945 personal narratives, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum collection has more than 3,500 publications in English alone. If you then add circumcision in any field, the search result is 1. Hence, I tried various other associated search terms, variants on children, hiding, passing, religious life, rescuing in the Holocaust, or skimmed suggestive titles like Survival Artist, or 7 Years on the Rhine in Hitler's Europe, or Among the Enemy, Hiding in Plain Sight in Nazi Germany. It is a rare memoir that has an index, a much rarer one that includes circumcision or related terms in its index. And rarer still is one that indexes indirect or euphemistic references. A small number of memoirs can be found on Amazon with the look inside function or are searchable on Google Books, but even then. So let me stop here. Excuse me. The share screen isn't working. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope my all too brief presentation may catalyze further research on circumcision and the Shoah, especially in languages that I've not mastered. And I would appreciate your sharing any circumcision-related scenes from your own research to j.geller@vanderbilt.edu. Thanks again, Christine, and to the organizers, and to my fellow participants.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks. That was also very interesting. Yes, everybody's silently clapping. Thank you to all the presenters. Before we turn to the questions, I just wanted to ask Ronnie or Danielle if you've heard from Megan. Is Megan here? No. Okay. So then I think
Megan.
Wrong Megan. Okay, sorry. Right. Okay. So should we move then to the questions? I've kind of been keeping track of them in chat. And I think the first one that we received came from Janine Holtz to Lauren. So I'm going to ask all the presenters, everybody else can keep their microphones muted, and if the presenters can unmute, and then they can feel free to jump in. But the first one is directed to Lauren, and if you think the gender of the interviewers in each case had an impact.
It's something that I don't know the answer to right now. So this is a question that I first came across watching a recording of a 2012 symposium that was held at Shoah Foundation with Remember the Women and Equality Now. And someone from one of those two institutions or places responded that on an anecdotal level, she thought that women were more likely to open up to other women. Having said that, Yeti, the survivor who I just talked about, opens up to a man. I think there are other factors at play. Dory Laub and Joanna Bodenstab talked about society, the narrator and the interviewer. Cord Pagenstecher talked about the mediality of testimonies also being an influence. I think it's a really interesting question, and as I continue my PhD project, it's definitely something that I will monitor and hope to feed back on at a later date. But right now, I think it's maybe a factor, but I don't know.
Do any of the other panelists want to comment on if you've used, as most of you have used, testimonies on the gender of the interviewer and how that impacted your reading of the testimonies. I'll give you a moment if you know. Tori, yeah.
I'm looking at testimonies to some extent, and they definitely, I mean, the women, my subjects have been women, you know, from early on. So, but there are many things that I look at when I'm looking at testimony that absolutely have to do with gender, especially because the women that I'm looking at are, you know, were going against the grain in various ways. They were going into science, they were doing other things, and these testimonies were taken or done later in their lives. And so there are aspects that they talk about with their Holocaust experiences, for instance, and how they relate to their later lives. And this is something that I find very interesting, because of all the different things that women in particular had to survive. They weren't just surviving a monolithic event. Of course, they were surviving other things, abuses of different kinds, sexual assault, sexual violence, pregnancies, and so forth. So all of these things come into play to some extent. But you know, it's hard for me to say how gender comes into it because my dissertation is about women.
Thank you.
I also have something to note. I'm doing some research on the Degok testimonies from Hungary, and I'm focusing more on one interviewer. Erna, that was her name, and I got in touch with some testimonies that she privately had at home because her granddaughter contacted me to ask about what these documents are at all. And that's when I started to read through only her typed testimonies of other people, when I realized that her reports are longer, much longer than the general Degok reports. So now I'm trying to look into other, well, we're talking about thousands of testimonies, so it will take time, but it is a significant difference that, for example, one of the testimonies that she typed was 6 pages long, while generally they are 3 to 4 pages long, or sometimes even 1 to 2 pages. So I'm not saying this is a gender difference. Perhaps it was her personality that the survivors opened up more closely, but it is a significant difference that is interesting to look into deeper.
Thanks, Alexandra.
There are also some research done by Tim Cole that are on using central words in women and men testimonies. Like, for example, women use we generally more often than I, and men use in their testimony phrase I more often than we. So that's the very big difference, I think.
Thank you. I'm just going to move to the next. The next was just a comment from Andrea Petu, complimenting Lorian on her paper. I'm sure she's seen it, but it's interesting because in all of the papers, there's been a discussion about archival neutrality and indexing, and in addition to the gendered aspects of interviewing, but of course the gendered aspects of archiving. And she notes, and of course I'm sure everybody has seen it, that the VHA didn't have rape as an indexing term, but Andrea has sent papers of her students at CEU for years complaining about it, and it's changed. So it's interesting to think about how research can affect change in archival practice. I don't know if Lauren, you want to comment?
I think, yeah, I mean, I was aware of the change that Andrea brought forward, and I think that that's something that I felt quite uncomfortable with in a way in my paper, critiquing the VHA in the way, time constraints, because they are open to people, I think, pointing out and saying, oh, hey, you might want to do this a little bit differently. And I think that's something to be commended, that they are happy to evolve with the times, maybe.
Right. Okay. The next question came from Sabina Hildebrandt, and I think this is probably directed to Bev. Were there known male victims of sexual abuse?
Yes, there were. Many. In fact, I think I don't have a count offhand in my head about the number of male children that were abused, but it's about 30 to 40 out of the 160 that I came across were boys that were abused. The male abuse occurred primarily amongst the peoples in the camps, those who served as sexual slaves, but also there are many boy accounts in the ghettos, in hiding. They also came under a fair amount of abuse there too. So yes, there are a number of boys.
If I may add that I've also encountered a couple where in schools and orphanages.
Yes,
and questions about the novelty of dealing with a Jewish boy's penis rather than a Gentile's.
Yes.
Lauren, did you want to add something? I saw you nodding, but just want to make sure that if you want to say.
I always think about this imagery of, and apologies if I don't pronounce this quite right, the people, these so-called male prostitutes, and I that's not my interpretation of what a prostitute would be at all, but the term that it crops up so often. It's a well-held image, so it's like it's there, but it needs rereading, and I think reinterpreting and re-understanding for how we have come to look at these stories now with a bit more understanding of pressures and all of the stuff that the other panelists and I have been trying to talk about.
If I can add to that, I don't refer to them as prostitutes at all. They really were sexual slaves, and so were the girls who were called prostitutes in those camps too. They're not sex workers. They were not prostitutes. They were sexual slaves. I don't know if anyone else has a better term for them. They were not complicit in this procedure most of the time, unless it was for survival. And there again, they're victims, not perpetrators in any way.
Thank you, Bev, for saying way more eloquently what I was trying to get at. Really appreciate that.
I see Boaz is raising a hand.
I would like to say, we saw, if we are into this sexual abuse of children, we saw the potential abusers, but I think two things we have to remember. There's also abuse by children in institutions. There's very interesting testimony in Israel that was not into, I think, archives, but is out, of someone who was abused in a children's home in the USSR. And it was very central to the story he was telling. And I think this, I saw in the question, this issue of, I asked and I saw other people responding, like Denisa, the issue of Jewish abusers. Why does it matter if we are looking at Jewish abusers? So I'll rephrase this. Abusers from the victim community. Victims are abusers. And I think we have this category, and we see, when I talk about this with my students, this is a really bad, it's really painful issue to accept that not everyone in the camp or in the ghetto was an angel.
Yes.
This issue, I think, should be raised. We're not talking only about perpetrators as or non-Jews as abusers. Unfortunately, we are talking also about members of the victim community. Some members of the victim community also are abusers, either of children or of women or.
It's a very difficult issue, this. And the abuse of children it raises a whole bunch of other questions. Are these pedophiles? And are all the perpetrators pedophiles, that they're aroused by children? And I don't believe that's the case. There were a few that were pedophiles. And in the one instance, one of the Jewish perpetrators from the victim community, as you nicely put it, I believe was actually a pedophile, was sexually abused, aroused by children. But for many of the others, it's a crime of opportunity. It's a crime of authoritarianism. These are people in positions of power over the children who are exposed to maybe young adolescent girls who are arousing. It's not that they necessarily would normally be only interested in children as sexual partners, but they just have opportunity, and they're in a situation which gives them privacy, where they can abuse the child and no one will ever come after them afterwards. This is many of the cases with the German perpetrators. It's often the case with the hidden children who were hidden and only available to the perpetrator, had no other recourse, nowhere else to go to, no one to call on for help, and they were often the ones that were abused. And in the hiding families, it's often other children, other boys, usually boys in the family, who would abuse a young girl who came in as part of that family. So there's children abusing children as well in that situation. So it's a very complex issue as to what are the motivations. And it's not, as we would often think, it's pedophilia. It's not. It's a crime of opportunity and authority and privacy and secrecy and just abuse.
Thank you. And actually kind of building on the issue of variations in term and complexities, Jan Bertzloff has asked what the geographical distribution of the 160 testimonies you included in your book, Bev. And of course, he's very excited to, as you can see, get his hands on your book.
Okay, I have not broken them down by geographical distribution. It made little sense. Because most of the children died, and that's all there was to it, did not survive. And it's those who survived who can tell their stories. So the geographical distribution will be influenced by where they were living most of the time. It happened everywhere. It happened in all countries. I did not have any particular country that came up a lot. Where there were a lot of Jewish children, there was a lot of abuse. And it's only a matter of who survived, could tell their story, and where they happened to be at that time. I don't think a geographic spread would tell us a lot more, that to say, well, more of the Polish children were abused. I don't think we could make that kind of conclusion, even if we were to find a lot of them were Polish or were Hungarian because they managed to survive for longer. I don't know. It's a hard question to answer that. I do report where it occurred. Someone else has raised a question a little bit later, and this links to it in terms of the anonymity of the victims. And if I can answer that now, because it refers again where they were, I gave pseudonyms to all of the children whose testimonies came from archives where privacy was requested and needed to be preserved. So many of my children have been given false names, and I, for that reason, do not identify them in any way other than to say how old they were and which country they came from, not which town or city or place. And I don't give dates or anything that reveal their identity. They're given false names. For those that report their own stories in their books or have been reported by name in other texts and contexts, I report their own names. But for most of the testimonies which came out of these archives where I have to respect privacy and so on, I respect the children's privacy. It relates to the issue. All of the children who give testimonies wanted their stories to be told. None of them were forced to give these testimonies. They themselves choose to tell their story. And I believe that we need to respect their memory by telling their story, by revealing them. Whether we preserve their privacy is another issue, but we need to tell their stories and to know what happened to them. And I think their very act of revealing their stories in testimonies or in their memoirs means that they actually want that story, that incident, that experience to be acknowledged and validated by us, to give them credit for it. But to preserve their privacy and that of their families is very important.
Thank you. And it looks like you've addressed most of Katarzyna's questions in her post. And there's actually a follow-up right after that by Andrea Pettu about the right to silence. So I don't know if you
It's
want
the
to.
same. It's the same question.
Same feeling. Yeah.
I think the right to silence, I think, is if they don't want anyone to know about it, they wouldn't have given it this information in their testimonies or in their memoirs. And there are some cases where women were abused, told their stories, say in a testimony at some point, then didn't want their children to know about it and removed it from their testimony for a while and reported that information in other contexts without the sexual abuse issues. And maybe later in life came back to it and said, this happened to me, I need to acknowledge it, or I want to acknowledge it. I think I preserve and I respect their personal views. If they don't want to tell their stories, then they don't. If they do tell their stories, then they want to. I've worked on that assumption.
Okay. I'm trying to follow.
Sorry, I jumped a few questions.
No, it's okay. Yeah, no, I'm trying to distribute a few of the questions across the speakers too, just to give you a break. So let's just hop to, there's one for all the panelists by Karen Remler. And it's, to what extent do you see shifts in public discourses about sexual abuse and responses about false memories, this is in quotes, particularly in the 90s, have dovetailed with revisiting of the issues that you were all raising? So I don't know if Jay, do you want to start amongst panelists?
That's something that I've really encountered, even with this issue that I'm specifically addressing. So actually, this is a question for most of us, if not all, but perhaps not all of us, specifically dealing with our research.
Any of the other panelists? Lauren? Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, I tried to have a read of, like you're doing your literature review, so you encounter all of this stuff about false memory syndrome. And I guess my work is about memory and remembering. But I found my background is as a historian, so while I want to respect what these women are telling us and sharing, there is a part of my brain that thinks it's necessary to do a little bit of background research just to corroborate really basic details. So, that's what I try and do for these women, but then there's also so many hallmarks when you begin to really engage with, sort of high figures of these testimonies and forms of remembering. You do get repeated tropes that are shared between women survivors, and also tropes that are shared just of women who've experienced sexual abuse in other contexts, other genocides, for instance. So my position is always to come at this from a point of, I believe, the women and respecting what she is recounting of her experience, and that's all I have to say on false memory syndrome. I have big problems with it. I think it's not super helpful.
Victoria, did you have something to add, or was that just a shifting?
Well, I think it's more about the taboo subjects. So
yeah. Well, there is a follow-up question from Rebecca Clifford about that. Just a little bit, I scrolled down a bit. And she's saying that, how far do you think the interviewer's own agenda and goals make a difference? And she's thinking particularly of a few cases from her own work on child survivors, where a child survivor discusses sexual abuse when talking to a psychologist in the 1980s, but stayed quiet about it when they gave a Shoah Foundation interview in the 90s. So how does the framing of the archival, the interview project frame what you've found?
Two things come to mind for me. The first is, I always think of Joan Ringelheim being told, you should be asking women about this, because otherwise they might not feel confident or that this is the right context in which to speak. I think it's, unsurprising that maybe someone would feel open talking about this in a therapy session with a psychologist compared to a life history interview done with a historian or someone who they don't have that relationship with. Not everyone is going to feel comfortable in sharing these memories because they are very difficult. They're difficult for participants to remember and to narrate and verbalize. They're difficult for an interviewer to listen to in the kind of appropriate way. So I don't think so much as it's to do about maybe an interviewer's agenda, that it's just the overall context of an interview setting versus therapy.
I mean, I've seen and heard varieties among interviewers. Some pursue, some, when they pause, sometimes they'll be euphemistic, sometimes they'll direct it, and sometimes they'll just change the subject. And so it seemed very much a matter of the comfort of the interviewer, whether to pursue. What do you mean you look Jewish, or something along those lines. So, but it really, there's no general rule as much as it was a matter of the personalities of each individual. Or in some cases, it seemed it was a matter of the schedule of, we have to go to this, we have to move to this, we have to move to that. And so we cannot linger here.
Right.
I think as well, just to build on that, what I found a lot of the time is that this recounting of these stories is happening at such a covert level that I can understand from the point of view of an interviewer that you might not actually hear what you are being, what someone might be sharing at that time. It might take a beat to kind of fully process that. So yeah, just to add.
Rebecca has a quick follow-up to her question. I'll ask her to unmute.
Hear me, Christine?
Yeah.
I think the moment passed, actually. It was going back to the discussion between Boaz and Beverley. Just to add that I'm thinking of at least one and possibly two examples from my own work where the abuser was another Jewish child in hiding. But Beverley did address that. It's incredibly complex thinking about who is the abuser and the fact that the abuser can also be a minor.
Yes.
Sometimes
also say Jewish child, yes.
I'm going to scroll up a bit. There's some interesting questions focused towards Victoria about the Swedish context. So if we can come back to her paper for a moment. This is from Kariana Hansen, and she is asking if you can say something about the categorization of survivors in Sweden and if they were known as quote unquote Jewish survivors, camp survivors, or survivors of the Shoah, or if they use any other categories and if these categories have evolved over time.
There have been a lot of different ways of referring to survivors in Sweden, and they have evolved over time. My colleague Christine Bagrell has just completed her dissertation, which I cited in my paper, and she talks about that to some extent in that. I've also written an unpublished work about that covers this, because it really is something that has changed over time. They were basically, called different things at different times, and the construction has changed over time as well. So it's been, and it is something that I've problematized as well, because you tend to feel, or I tend to feel at times like even just calling them survivors is essentializing. But then it's sort of a necessary evil if you're summarizing your work, if you're speaking about something in your work in general terms. So it's something in my writing that I've explored, and I've problematized both the different terminology that has been used and the terminology that I have to use as a researcher working with them. Because I'm also working with non-Jewish survivors. Some of the women I'm working with are non-Jewish survivors. So a lot of times I'm looking at the way I'm referring to them and saying Holocaust survivors and concentration camp survivors, but then Holocaust survivors were also concentration camp survivors. So, it's one of those things.
And there's a related question on that from Andrea Petu about calling survivors subjects. And she asked if there are consequences of calling them subjects.
Yes, and I actually choose that term because for the most part, the women I'm researching have been objects. They've been treated as objects in research, and they've been inserted or they've been talked about in research. They haven't been the subjects of research. And in my dissertation, I'm working on making them the subjects of the research because they were subjects of the socio-historical processes in which I'm writing or which I'm writing about. So I do at times deliberately call them the subjects of my research because I do place them as subjects. And I think that hasn't always been the case in writing post-war narratives here in Sweden. So it's important to me to use that terminology, although I know that can be problematized as well. But I also follow a line where, I follow Mitchell Rolfe Trouillot, who says that in the socio-historical process, everyone is an actor, an agent, and a subject. And I'm looking at uncovering the ways that these women were those three. So I guess I could walk around going the actors, agents, and subjects of my research, but again, my presentation was only 7 minutes long. I guess I could read you some of the papers I've written, and they're, quite a bit longer.
To increase our word count. And then actually just on that, on the note about post-war narratives, Maiden Shachar has asked if, as you know that Sweden, you must know about planning the Holocaust Museum, and if you know if the subject of female survivors in Sweden will be part of the narrative. And she also asked a second part, if you've contacted survivors that eventually left Sweden and researched their lives after leaving.
So to the first question, I was peripherally involved in the early discussions about the Holocaust Museum, along with Boaz and Malin Tortorabi, who were here, among others, Andrea Petu as well. So I don't think it came up as much as it could have, but it did come up. And hopefully the survivors will be at the center of this new museum, and the issue of gender will play a significant role in the new Holocaust Museum. There's a volume out, there's an anthology out, which Boaz and Malin and Andrea contributed to, which discusses these topics, that is available as a PDF online. But again, I don't think gender comes up enough, but that's spoken as someone who focuses on gender. And in Sweden, as I wrote in my paper, the survivors haven't always been at the center of analyses or at the center of the discussion. They have often been drawn out and referred to when necessary, but I think that they could be more central, and their ongoing testimonies, and Lauren referenced him as well, Hank Greenspan, their lives are their testimonies, and I think their whole lives and what they did in Sweden are testimonies to who they were and what they experienced. And I think those should be very much part of the Holocaust Museum here in Sweden. And fortunately, Hank Greenspan was involved in speaking at that conference that we had in February, and he brought this up. And so we hope that will be a part of it. In regard to the second part, yes, I have. And actually, I was contacted last November by a woman who was finalizing the publication of the memoirs of a woman in Canada, a survivor who is still alive, a Polish Catholic survivor, who came to Sweden as part of one of the rescue and relief operations, and remained here in the country until the 1950s, and was educated at one of the technology universities here in Sweden. She left because she couldn't, there were various reasons why she left, but she left and she went on to become involved in a scientific breakthrough. And so I have actually considered incorporating her, even though she left Sweden. I think it still is an important aspect of that time period, and the fact that survivors were taking different paths, because a lot of what was happening in the post-war period in Sweden was survivors were being put in the labor market. They were being used in the post-war labor market. And the women that I'm writing about in that one particular group, they went against that. They took a different path, and they took a path that was obviously against the norm in many ways. It was defying gender, it was defying class, it was defying ethnicity, and it has not been, I don't think, sufficiently represented. So I think this type of individual, in other words, someone who left Sweden, would be a very interesting component to that. So yeah, I hope to find more, actually. I hope to find more women in this group, and in all of the groups, actually. It's a work in progress.
Thank you. Maybe we can turn back to some of the questions directed towards Jay. There's a question from Eliana Adler, who is asking, who's saying that we have his heroic stories of families who went to great lengths to circumcise their sons in the midst of the Holocaust. And she knows of one family story of the choice not to circumcise a baby in 1941. And she wanted to know, Eliana wanted to know if that was something you saw in your sources.
Quite a few both ways, including some moments of, where the rabbi says to circumcise, if you circumcise, the child will live. And of course, the story is passed on by a child who lived. So no doubt there were numerous instances where this may have happened, but the child did not live. Situations where the Gentiles would say, how can you do this? You're risking your own child. Others where they'll do it regardless. Varieties of different. One thing which I would like to mention is actually took place in a concentration camp where they tried to imagine life after survival. Whether or not they would circumcise, if they had sons afterward, whether or not they would circumcise. And the witness said it was sort of 50-50. Several said they would circumcise a son if they survived, and several said they would not. And again, motivations vary behind this. Many for protection, many because of the out of anger, and others for tradition, for parents. But there are many accounts of this. So again, when circumcision does show up in the indexing, very often it deals with either scenes in DP camps or the decision being made whether in ghettos or in hiding. And there are a range of responses. So it was indeed a crucial issue.
And there's a similar question from Terkel Streda from Copenhagen, specifically about Theresienstadt, about the decision to circumcise or not, if you've had any specific
there's one brief reference in Adler's book. One thing that which has really surprised me is that at least in those accounts dealing with the history of religious life during the Shoah that are available in languages that I can read, so English, German, or French, and those that have been translated into these languages, there's there's almost no mention of circumcision, and I have no idea why.
Interesting.
And there's another question that sort of ties some of the panels together from Atina Grossman. She's asking if there's any trace of post-war sexual and marital difficulties ascribed to the quote-unquote problem of the penis, as we've heard described for children subjected to sexual abuse.
Well, insofar as for children survivors who were had to hide their, make sure they peed in private, bathed in private, and all the rest. Several talk about how they still, 40 years later, will not strip in any sort of public scene. So those kinds of forced habits become part of how they view their own body subsequently.
Okay, I'm going through the questions and seeing which ones we've sort of covered. Apologies. There's another from Karen Remler. Back to narratives about taboo topics. In terms of shifts in the content of narratives around taboo topics in survivor narratives who have given subsequent testimonies, she's suggesting to see the work of Erwin Staub. And he interviewed survivors decades after their initial interview and tracked the differences over time. So that was just a follow-up comment. There's a question to Bev from Jochai Copenhagen, who is asking if you attempted to make any comparison to child sex abuse of non-Jewish children in the specific societies relevant to your research. Without ameliorating the issue, the question of the acceptable standards in society may prove to have some relevance.
It's a very fascinating question. No, my personal research in this particular book did not compare non-Jewish children and Jewish victims of sexual abuse. I am nearing the end of another book on child sex abuse, where I do look at European standards of child sex abuse at that time, but that's a different story. The reality is that Jewish children, all children are protected in their family environments to some extent from sexual abuse. In the Nazi situation, in the Holocaust, the Jewish family structure was totally disintegrated, and the normal controls and safeties that children would have in a family were broken down in the Jewish family. They didn't have, sometimes the father had lost his job or left to find another position somewhere. And those kind of parental controls, mothers then went out to work or had to work as well as look after children. People in schools, the teachers were not sensitive to Jewish children, not caring about them, excluded them. So Jewish children in their family situation were exposed to vulnerable situations. They were more open to abuse than perhaps non-Jewish children in a standard family structured situation would be. And of course, children sent into hiding, living with strange families and strange so-called parents or rescuers, would have been exposed to situations which would normally never ever happen to a child. So it's not that the Holocaust encouraged the abuse of Jewish children more than any other children. It's just that it created situations for children where they became much more vulnerable to abuse. And I believe people use that abuse, use those situations. They were opportunists, what I call opportunistic crimes. So I don't have any specific data that tells me that abuse of Jewish children was more or less than non-Jewish children at that time. But certainly the entire family structure and the security structure and the protection systems that we have in place in families and for children during the Holocaust were so totally eradicated that these children were simply exposed to opportunities for sexual abuse far more often than I would expect average families would have been in that time. But I have no data to verify that in terms of numbers right now.
And I think that gets a bit to Matt Fox's question about, you may have seen it, if you can identify any unique nature of the abuse in the context of Jewish victims versus, for example, abuse towards all Starvita victims. So I think, you've sort of answered that question, that you just don't have the data. There's been a question that's come in from Sabina Hildebrand about research on generational transmission of abuse. And I believe that was part of another question as well. So it'd be good if you and maybe Lauren could discuss that.
I did not look at the impact of the children's experiences as adults on their children. It's another whole area of research of the second generation component, and I did not go into that for my own research. It's a whole different kettle of fish, and I'm sure it's had an effect. Certainly, I know, as someone mentioned, the Fortunov library recordings specifically said to interviewees that these recordings were being made for their children and for their families to know what happened to them. And those tend to not have much in the way of reference to sexual abuse. The Shoah Foundation in interviews specifically asked about sexual abuse and do code for that, to some extent for that. So we do get many more reports from those interviews about sexual abuse. But whether that is part of the transmission to the next generation, I don't know. Most of the time, you know, people either talked excessively about their Holocaust experiences, or they didn't talk at all. So I do not know how far the sexual abuse of the children influenced their to their own children.
Pretty much the same answer to Bev. This is not something that I have looked at in my work or particularly come across.
Okay, if my co-hosts can help me to see if I've missed anyone. I've been trying to make sure that I've pulled them together, the questions.
There was a Karaite question.
Ah, yes, there. I'm trying to find that one. If you have it in your head, Jay, feel free to answer. I thought I missed that.
I mean, the Karaites managed to avoid general persecution, but they made an agreement. They had to give lists of every member of their community to the occupying forces. Consequently, if someone claimed to be a Karaite, it could be checked against the list. So very rarely was anyone able successfully to claim Karaite, unless they indeed were Karaite. More often they would claim North African, or especially in Eastern Europe, you know, Tatar and various versions of, you know, Muslim, Azerbaijanis, you know, Uzbeks. So there were many times, or Turks, or in Bosnia, again, a number of individuals would claim Muslim identity, Turkic, a variety of different, but Karaite was not a successful strategy.
Interesting. And then there is another question about, from Dana Iglidis, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. They are asking if the USC, so about the differences in non-inclusion of questions, if for example, the USC Shoah Foundation interviews included a question about sexual violence in the Battery, but earlier interviews like those from the Yale Fortunoff archive did not. And if the non-inclusion of these questions asking implies that it wasn't an important subject at that time. And that might have to be our last question of the session. If anybody would like to
I'm
close
not sure if it wasn't seen that it wasn't an important subject. It's just that we were embarrassed to ask about it. I think we didn't know how to deal with it, and because we didn't ask about it, they didn't tell about it. I just think it's not something that people spontaneously talk about. We know today that even adults who are sexually abused can take decades before they reveal their stories. If you think about the conference on women's experiences in the Holocaust, which was held in New York in 1981, I think, for the first time, of the survivors, and the children, certainly the survivors, they would talk about their own experiences, but it took them another 10 years before they started to reveal their sexual abuse experiences. And this is 40, 50 years later. So whether people would spontaneously talk about sexual abuse in the 70s, 60s, I think is unlikely. This is a taboo subject, or has been. We've not been as open about sexuality in the last 70 years as we are now. So I think it's just something that was not covered. Not that it wasn't important, but it wasn't talked about. It was taboo.
Thank you.
I think right after the war, you did see people addressing these issues, survivors. You could see it in the questionnaire of the Vilna ghetto. Asks right after the war, asks about prostitution and other issues like this. But you can also see, we published in East European Jewish Affairs a notebook of child testimonies from 1945. I did this with Beata Muller. And there are testimonies there where the girl, people are implying sexual issues and they stop, or the person who took the testimony says she started crying, or she says, I did what I had to do, or so you see that we have very early references that did not repeat themselves. There was there were decades of silence. But right after the war, survivor community, people were aware, I think, of this. People are talking about I heard this from Tzu, a researcher in Israel, saying that girls were used to being used sexually. Girls in the Zionist groups were used from the wartime to be used sexually. And people were discussing how do we do sexual education. And so these issues were discussed right after the war.
Right after the war, yes.
But then
I came across that too.
Comes after that.
I came across that too in my looking at women's experiences. Immediately after the war, the memoirs that were written or the diaries that were emerged soon after the war were far more explicit and talked about sexual abuse and sexual experiences. Later on, these became hidden. I think perhaps as they tried to move on and to make family life and didn't want their children to know or their husbands to know. Many times they didn't tell their stories to their partners. And it became something suppressed. Also, they were sometimes accused of surviving because they used sex, and that was hard to live with. So, yes, immediately after the war, people talked about what happened. Within some decades, it was hidden again.
Lauren, did you want to say?
Yeah, sorry, just as a really short follow-up. It's kind of a half tail on from this idea of non-inclusion of a direct question. I certainly have women who are sharing these memories in a non-elicited way. You know, this is an organic thing that they just, you know, they're asked a question about one thing and then they do start telling, you know, memories of sexual violence within this other story. So I think it would be wrong to say that just because women were not being asked about it didn't mean that they weren't telling us about it. And I think Boaz kind of was referencing this idea of, you know, memories being quite covertly expressed. So it's important to think not just about the more obvious stories that we can all point to and say, yes, that's an assault, that's a rape. You know, there's this whole range of things going on that sometimes involve us having to read much more in a detailed way.
I'm with you there. I agree with you. But there's another issue too, and came up with I think Gay's discussions about the penis, the unwillingness to refer directly and to use the words that we now use more commonly. For example, in the sexual abuse stories, you sometimes get women saying, "He lay with me," not "he had sex with me."
Yeah.
So it makes it harder to find those references, especially when you're trying to use indexes and keywords. It makes it much harder to find the references that are sexual. And then you have to think, am I interpreting it and putting sex abuse into that story? Mm-hmm. Is he lay with me, meaning he lay with me, but he didn't have sex with me? I mean, what does it really mean if she doesn't say it? So it's a complex area. And one has to be careful what we interpret. I do include examples of that in the book, which I do not include in my account, but which I give as examples of how difficult it is to sometimes interpret the stories.
Well, thank you. I think we can all agree that was a fascinating panel and an equally fascinating discussion. So thank you to all the panelists and all of the participants for all of your questions. And of course, to Boaz and Daniela and Roni for organizing. And I hope everyone returns for the next session. But yes. Thank you again, and silent and non-silent round of applause. Thank you to everyone for this important discussion.
Thank you to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine.